everybody, and welcome back to my channel, and happy Harloween. Guys, it's the perfect day to be recording a Harloween video. It's chilly outside, it's overcast, it's got that nice crisp feeling in the air. Got my coffee, got my flannel blanket, and we're ready to talk about some spooky stuff. Today's video is actually a case or a story that took place a long time ago, so this is definitely a historically based video. This is about the dancing plague of 1518, and it's something that happened a long time ago that people are still trying to find the answer for today. And if you guys have been enjoying Harloween thus far, please hit the like button and go ahead and subscribe and hit the notification button so that you can get notified every time I post a video for Harloween. Okay, so you've heard about the bubonic plague, the Black Death that happened in the Middle Ages, but have you ever heard of the dancing plague? Let me go ahead and set the stage for you. We are going to the Alsace region in northern France, more specifically to the city of Strasbourg during the summer of 1518. This area at that time was considered to be a free imperial city in the Holy Roman Empire. This was over 100 years before the armies of Louis XIV invaded and made the city part of France. It happened in July, a week before the festival of Mary Magdalene, and it all started with one woman. Her name was Frau Trophea. An eyewitness claimed that her husband asked her to do a task that she really didn't want to do, that she didn't like doing. So she walked outside of their house, and in the middle of the street, she started to dance. Passerbyers didn't think too much of it until her dancing went on for hours, and she finally collapsed. But it wasn't the end of her dancing. When she came to, she got back up and continued to dance. No matter how much her husband pleaded with her to stop, no matter how much people who were passing by stopped and stared, she continued to dance. A crowd of confused people began to gather around her as she continued to rhythmically move her body to music that just wasn't there. Initially, they just thought she was acting out a weird rebellion against her husband, who'd asked her to do something she didn't want to do. But as the dancing continued for hours and hours, people began to wonder if she was maybe possessed by something nefarious. Now, you have to remember, this was 1518, so this was prime time for people to attribute things that seemed a little bit abnormal or a little bit out of the ordinary to demonic possession or some sort of interference from the heavens or from hell. She appeared to be in some kind of trance. She showed no facial expression, no emotion, no recognition that there was people, huge crowds starting to gather around her to watch her performance. After continuing this dancing for hours, having nothing to eat, nothing to drink, she finally collapsed on the ground again, covered in sweat. At this point, her audience thought the odd occurrence was over, but when she came to, she got up and began dancing again. So reports vary. Obviously, this happened a very long time ago, so actually being able to speak to actual eyewitnesses was impossible, but reports vary on how long she continued to dance for. There's a general consensus that she kept this up for days, and every so often she would pass out, and then she would wake up and continue to dance. And her dancing became more frenzied as time went on. Her movements became more jerky and violent. And eventually, her body was bruised. Her feet were bloodied. Obviously, something had to be done. So Frau Trophea was taken away to a nearby shrine to be healed by God. Whether her affliction was the work of heaven or hell, no one could say. But they figured the only way to heal her was to bring her to a holy place to expel whatever it was that had influenced her. If this had happened to only one person, history would have written it off as some kind of mental illness, or maybe wouldn't have even considered it important enough to even record and talk about in 2019. But as Frau Trophea danced, others joined in. At first, the illness affected about 30 people, but as July turned to August, over 400 people joined in on the dancing. And the same thing happened to them. They would dance until they collapsed, and then get up to continue dancing despite blood soaking through their shoes. It was estimated that up to 15 people a day were dying from their exertions, and the city realized they needed to step in and do something. They didn't know if this growing movement was caused by something medical or religious, a plague brought upon the people of Strasbourg as punishment for their sins, much like the Great Flood that had wiped out most of civilization, save for Noah and his ark, that held his sons, their wives, and female-male pairs of every living creature in the world. The Privy Council of the city met with experts in religion and medicine to figure out how they could stop the insane dancing. They went back and forth on whether this was caused by God, the devil, or some sort of sickness. And of course, the medical experts in the city, they didn't want to believe that it could have something to do with God or Satan or a demon or an angel. These were logical men. So they at first treated these people as if they had some kind of sickness or ailment that could be explained by science. The physicians said the dancers most likely suffered from a condition where their blood had gotten too hot, so they felt compelled to dance to find relief from it, which really doesn't make sense if you think about it. I'm no doctor, but it just feels like the more you would dance and the more physically you would exert yourself, the hotter your blood would get. But maybe because they thought when people danced a lot or did a lot of physical activity, they sweat, which was kind of getting rid of the hotness in their blood. It doesn't make any sense. But then again, you have to realize that back in the 1518, they didn't have a lot of the medical technology that we have today. So they also put leeches on people when they got sick and bled them. This was 1518, so medical professionals were still operating on the theory of humorism, or the four humors. And this whole medical theory of humorism, or the four humors, is incredibly interesting and goes really in depth, and I wish I could go into more detail. And if you guys ever want me to do a video, like a historical video on the four humors or humorism and where it came from, how it was practiced in medicine, and how it actually still does influence doctors today in what they believe and what they study, let me know in the comments, and I would love to do that just as a fun video. But basically, humorism was you have these four humors in your body, and it's blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. It's horrible. Phlegm's the worst word ever. And if all of these things in your body were acting harmoniously and in balance, you're good, you're healthy. But if any of them are off or imbalanced, that's the cause of whatever illness you have. So they have to track it back to one of these humors to see what it is that's causing you issues. So basically, these doctors in 1518 were saying, listen, it's the blood. The blood's too hot. There's an imbalance here. We have a reason of why these people are dancing like maniacs, trying to cool their blood down. And these people were not dancing happily. Their bodies were making the movements of somebody who was filled with joy and dancing from happiness, but their faces either showed no expression at all or were contorted in the most painful ways. And those who could express themselves made it very clear that they weren't doing this of their own free will, that they were not in control any longer of their bodies. They wanted to stop. They just couldn't. They opened these two big guild halls for a dancing party, thinking that if the dancers had an outlet or a place to dance, they would just get it out of their system and everybody could move on with their lives. They brought in bands to play music and healthy citizens who had not been afflicted by this dancing illness to dance with them. Obviously, this did not work. In fact, it made things worse because those who had previously been uninfected by whatever it was that was causing these people to dance against their will, they now began to come down with the dancing plague. It was spreading, so obviously the town had to pivot. They had to change their approach and how they were handling this. Letting them just dance was not helping, and they had to face the possibility that what was going on with these people might not be able to be explained by science or medicine. So they pulled a footloose, basically. They outlawed dancing in the town. They even outlawed any music that would make people feel like they wanted to dance, anything that had any kind of beat to it. They made special exceptions for things like weddings and celebrations like that, but in general, they were like, no dancing, no music, this will work. But of course it didn't. Many of these people, like Frau Trofea, who had first come down with this illness that made you just dance without any control, they hadn't needed music in the first place, and they didn't need it now. The afflicted would continue dancing, sometimes to the point of death. So they gathered up all of these dancing people. They collected their writhing bodies, and as they were still dancing, they basically picked them up and laid them down on wagons and tied them to the wagons. So they're still squirming, they're still trying to dance as they're being put on these wagons and tied to the wagons. And they drove the wagons with these writhing bodies on them 25 miles away to the shrine of Saint Vitus. Saint Vitus was a Christian saint from Sicily who died as a martyr when he was just a child. Today, he's considered to be the patron saint of actors, comedians, dancers, and epileptics. He's also said to protect against lightning strikes, animal attacks, and oversleeping. But in his life, Saint Vitus was known for being able to perform healings by the simple act of laying his hands on those who were ill, especially those who suffered from conditions of unsteady step and trembling limbs. According to reports, those who were tied to the wagons still trying to dance were untied and released from the wagons, and they danced their way into the shrine of Saint Vitus, where they fell in front of his image. A mass was said over them, and each of the dancers was given a pair of red shoes that had been blessed, and then they were cured. Historically, the dancing plague has been referred to as Saint Vitus's dance. Now, this could be for several different reasons. Obviously, some believe it's because being at his shrine helped cure the people of their dancing plague. Some believe it was because the people who were dancing and had no control of their own bodies had been cursed in the name of Saint Vitus. And some believe that Saint Vitus himself had actually sent down this plague to punish people for not giving him enough attention. But what was the actual reason for these people to dance ceaselessly, sometimes even dancing themselves into their own graves? Many people have theories. A physician and alchemist named Paracelsus visited Strasbourg a few years after the plague, and he became so interested in the story that he did some digging to try and get to the bottom of it. Through his research, he discovered that Frau Troffea's husband hated it when she danced, so she did it to annoy him. The dancing plague was essentially the product of an unhappy marriage, and others joined in out of sexual frustration, interest, or just plain boredom. Paracelsus claimed that the sufferers were whores and scoundrels. He said that they should have been locked in a dark room, given only bread and water until they snapped out of it. While it may be true that Frau Troffea's husband had an aversion to dancing, it's a hard thing to swallow, or a hard thing to believe that so many other people would have joined in just out of curiosity or boredom or sexual frustration. The fact that this dancing sometimes drove people to their own deaths makes it hard to believe that someone would keep this up after becoming sick or ill or not eating or getting so weak to the point where they were passing out just because they were interested in what was happening or they were bored. Some people believe that societal stress was the cause of the plague. If you were alive in the 16th century, you'd most likely be poor and struggling. There really wasn't a middle class. You were either very wealthy, part of the nobility or royalty, which made up less than 1% of the population, or you were dirt poor and trying to figure out where your next meal was going to come from every single day. Religion was also a huge driving force in this time period, with most people, if not all people, believing that when things happened, they were the work of God or the devil. So when everyone saw this one woman dancing, apparently without any control over her body, they might have assumed that she was being punished for something. And with the religious guilt that so many people carried, they may have felt that they deserved to be punished for something. So this, combined with the stress of just trying to survive at this time period, may have been enough to break people mentally. There's also a theory that something called Tarantism was to blame. Before and after 1518, stories of people partaking in these trance-like dances were reported. In 1728, a young woman in southern Italy named Anna Palazzo was working in the vineyards when she was bit by a tarantula. She collapsed, and the young men working with her in the vineyards brought her into town, not to be seen by a doctor, but to be seen by musicians. Because of her bite, the locals thought she had become a tarantata, bit by a tarantola, a spider that was prevalent in local lore and legend. And the only way to heal someone from such a bite was to play music for them so they could dance and be cured. As the music was played, Anna eventually got up and began to move to it, and after 2 days of dancing, she was healed. Many physicians from that time documented occurrences of Tarantism. It would mostly be women, but sometimes men, who would become the victims of this venomous spider, or sometimes scorpion, and they would then remain unresponsive, only recovering once they had danced for as long as it took for the ailment to be cured. People who came down with Tarantism would become almost possessed. They would hear music and melodies and drag themselves across the floor and try to climb up walls the way a spider would. Later, when Anna was an older woman, she wrote to a friend and said that the spiders were haunting her. She said, quote, "I cannot eat because my plate is filled with fat scorpions. I cannot drink because my glass is full of tarantulas too, and last night my bed was packed with creatures." Some scholars believe that Tarantism has its roots in ancient Greece, when the worshippers of Dionysus gathered in groups to honor him with ecstatic, trance-like dancing. But this was not just a crazy thing that happened in ancient and medieval times. In the 1990s, a family brought their grandmother to a mental health clinic in Salento. They claimed she'd been having psychotic episodes. The psychiatrist that treated her later told a friend that, quote, "That little grandma was a tarantata. The family didn't understand what was happening. They didn't know she needed music." Another strange dancing event that happened hundreds of years before the dancing plague in Strasbourg was the children's dancing plague of 1237. Roughly 100 children began dancing in the streets of Erfurt, Germany. They danced all the way to the town of Arnstadt before collapsing from exhaustion. Many believe that the story of the Pied Piper arose from this tale. The children were returned to their parents, but some of them died shortly thereafter. And the ones that survived lived with a tremor that would stay with them for their entire lives. Again, in Germany in the 1300s, groups of people took to the streets dancing. In sharp, convulsing movements, they would hop about, foaming at the mouth and scaring the crap out of everyone who watched. The Black Death had just ravaged most of Europe, and people didn't want to mess around with anything that looked as though it might be contagious. Afterward, those who had been affected claimed they had no control of themselves. They were just compelled to dance until they passed out. In 1374, in several towns along the Rhine River, hundreds of people fell under the dancing spell. Within weeks, the dancing had spread into northeastern France and the Netherlands, and continued to spread and grow for months until it faded away. In 1491, a nunnery in the Spanish Netherlands saw several nuns becoming possessed by devilish familiars who compelled them to race around like dogs, jump out of trees like birds, and claw their way up trees like cats. Over the next 200 years, everywhere from Rome to Paris, you'd find nuns who were suddenly plunged into these states of delirium. They would foam at the mouth, scream, and convulse, and if an exorcism was called, they would proposition the priest who came to perform it, if you know what I mean. And there's so many theories about why these things may have happened. Some believe that every single person over the years who took part in this dancing plague were part of a heretical set who had pre-planned this. So basically like this secret religion, and they said, we're gonna freak everybody out, and over the course of many hundreds of years, suddenly we are just gonna, plunge ourselves into this dancing hysteria and scare the crap out of people, essentially. Some modern scholars believe that it would have something to do with something that the people ate, like tainted wheat, or maybe something in the atmosphere that caused people to have hallucinations, like the Oracle of Delphi. And if you don't know about the Oracle of Delphi, it was considered to be one of the most sacred sites in ancient Greece. And there was basically a woman who lived there, and she was called the Pythia, and it would change who this woman was. Obviously, she didn't live forever, but as one oracle passed on, a new oracle would be appointed, and people would come from all over the world to listen to this woman because they thought she could tell the future, or she could see the future. Her prophecies would dictate when a simple farmer would plant his wheat fields. Her prophecies would also dictate when an emperor would declare war, or who he would declare war on. This woman was considered to be getting her information directly from the god Apollo. So obviously modern scientists wanted to understand how the Oracle of Delphi was able to go into these very deep trance-like states and then come out spouting off prophecies. So they investigated and they figured out that because of a fault, I think it was a fault due to an earthquake, there was some gases that were coming up into the temple where she lived, and this basically put her in these trance-like situations and caused her to have hallucinations and deliriums that made her think she was seeing things or seeing the future. That's their explanation for it. I prefer to believe something way cooler, like, she was talking to Apollo and he was giving her the information, but, that's what science says. So they're basically saying that maybe there was something in these towns where all of these things happened, like at the Oracle of Delphi, a gas or a substance that caused these people to behave in this way. American medical historian John Waller has written several papers about the dancing plague of 1518, and he's come up with his own theory of why it happened. He says that the decade before had been a traumatic time. Famine, sickness, and terribly cold weather conditions had devastated Strasbourg. Leprosy, plague, and syphilis were spreading like wildfire through the starving population. Bread was being sold at historically high prices. The people were under a great amount of stress and despair, and what actually spread amongst them was the idea of dancing. The power of suggestion, like what happened with the Salem witch trials. One girl starts talking about how this lady in the town of Salem is working with the devil, and she's a witch, and she's been attacking her at night. And then all of a sudden, her little friends and other girls in the town are saying the same things and pointing fingers at the same woman. And then they're pointing fingers at different people and saying the same thing about them. Is it more likely that some of the townspeople were actually servants of Satan harassing the youth of Salem, or that the idea that this could be true spread from one person to the next, causing them to become part of the problem? Psychogenic disorder outbreaks take place under circumstances of extreme stress and generally take form based on local fears. So the term psychogenic disorder is often applied to situations where we can't point to a physical issue or a physical reason or biomarker that this is happening. So it's basically a catch-all for the things that we can't explain with science. Psychogenic movement disorders are characterized by unwanted movements such as spasms, shaking, or jerks involving any part of the face, neck, trunk, or limbs. Some patients may have a bizarre gait or difficulties with their balance that are caused by underlying stress or some psychological condition. In each of the strange occurrences that we talked about, we can pinpoint specific circumstances that preceded the odd behavior. Before the 1374 outbreak, the areas on the Rhine River saw excessive flooding. One of them was called the worst flood of the century. The waters of the Rhine rose to an astounding 34 feet. Those who witnessed it told stories of watching the floodwaters rush into their towns and homes and seeing the bodies of decomposing horses bobbing through the waters that were rushing through their town. The 1400s would have been a tough time for nuns as well, because the thing with the nunneries and all of these nuns acting very strange, that was definitely something for me that I was interested in finding an explanation for. The evangelical reform was sweeping through the Catholic Church, attempting to bring back the stricter spiritual ways of the past centuries. The nuns were suddenly expected to live extremely piously, eat nothing but bland food, sleep on hard mattresses, talk to no one. A lot of the times the nuns were expected to take vows of silence. They were expected to turn away from all forms of vanity and focus instead specifically on abstinence and self-abasement, which is basically just belittling oneself, telling yourself all the ways you're not good enough, all the things you're bad at. Instead of being able to socialize with their fellow nuns, they were now expected to be alone most of the time and meditate all the time alone. Because of these incredibly harsh expectations, many of these women were crushed. They could not live up to these expectations. No person really could. So essentially, the theory at this point for why all of these things happened, including the dancing plague of 1518, is that given the circumstances in these people's lives at this time, most of them could not be expected to function or live in a mentally healthy sort of way. And being under these hard conditions, having to face poverty, having to face hunger, having to watch your own children die from starvation or illness, signing up to be a nun and expecting this life of sisterhood and reading the Bible together and talking about God, and all of a sudden the Catholic Church is like, no, that's not what being a nun is about anymore. Now we want you to just lay on a piece of wood and eat nothing but oatmeal and make sure you tell yourself at least 50 times a day how much you suck and be alone all the time. You know, these kinds of circumstances are going to put your mental health under a very big amount of strain, especially when you don't see any way out. And during these times, people who were poor, people who were hungry, people who were constantly getting sick, and there was plagues that were just rushing through their towns and killing off a quarter of their population, they didn't see a light at the end of the tunnel. They didn't see a place or a time where life wouldn't be like this. So it broke them. It mentally broke them. And they began dancing until they died, or pretending to be spiders and crawling up walls, or pretending to be birds and jumping out of trees. It makes no sense to us in today's day and age because even when things are really bad, we can always see a place where they might get better. We can always figure out a way to make them better. But back in those days, there was no such thing as social mobility. You weren't going to be a poor peasant and then suddenly, within a year, work your way up to being a king. Your life circumstances were what they were going to be for the rest of your life, and what your children's life circumstances were going to be, and their children after them. There was really no hope in these people's lives. So it makes complete sense why they may have gone a little nuts. With the dancing plague of 1518, is it more likely that all of these people were possessed by an evil spirit, or cursed by God or Saint Vitus, or getting bit by evil tarantulas? Or is it more likely that one person started dancing to piss off her controlling husbands, and others followed because they were tired and hungry and under a great amount of pressure, and they wanted to believe that some greater power was at work, because that might give meaning to all that they were going through? Either way, whether it was an actual contagion or a sign of a society that had reached its breaking point, the dancing plague of 1518 is one of those weird historical occurrences that I don't think will ever be fully explained. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Have you ever heard of this story before? Would you be more likely to believe that they were possessed by God or the devil, or they were being punished by Saint Vitus, or that socioeconomic conditions pretty much just broke these people? Let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you so much for being here, and I can't wait to see you for the next Harloween video. Stay kind, stay beautiful, and stay spooky. Bye. I just realized how accurate my dancing skeleton pillow is for this video. Like, too accurate. Like, maybe I should have taken it down before the video, because now I feel like I was disrespectful to all those people that dance themselves to death by talking about it while there's a pillow of dancing skeletons behind me. Stephanie Harlowe is canceled.